Hey there, online world. Welcome to the Peers Inspiring video series where we call in the best of humanity, the qualities of life that give us deeper meaning, and the creative remedies for the societal challenges we face today. And today we explore the power of sharing and how it's catalyzing a growing movement of ordinary people learning the skills to govern themselves, build an economy that serves all, and create powerful community networks in the face of the world's greatest challenges. Well, here with me today is my friend Tom Llewellyn, the interim executive director for Shareable, a nonprofit news and action hub promoting people-powered solutions for the common good. And as an educator, activist, community organizer, speaker, producer for an award-winning film and podcast series, and a professional party starter. Tom is helping build a powerful movement based on the creative potential of sharing. So please read more about Tom's amazing work in the description. Such important and inspiring work. So welcome, Tom. Thanks for being with me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So let's just arrive and ground together, finding our breath and just taking a deep breath in and out. And anyone tuning into this video can join in for just a moment. So let's string the beads between you and I, Tom, to call in the energy and tone for our time together. Um, Each of us represents a bead of the larger wisdom that we're going to explore today. So I asked Tom to bring a favorite poem to start our conversation as his bead, and my bead will be a really brief story of why the topic of sharing touches me really deeply. And then we'll dive into the interview itself. So, Tom, we'd love to hear the poems you brought.
Yeah, so I have been planning on bringing which I'll say in a moment. And then today I had another one come my way. So I'll start with that one. And this one is um, a poem called For My Friend, and it was written by Huey P. Newton and Erica Huggins in July of 1972, who are both leaders of the Black Panther Party. Someday, when the heroes of today have all been rendered to song, and all the garlands have withered and are cast aside, you will remember that the songs they sang were only words,
Mm.
that all the garlands were just colored paper flowers. You will remember then my love was real, that it was not words because I told you more in a touch, and it was never created to be beautiful because our conditions, our lives are so ugly. You'll remember then, if you too are not a hero in a song, that I listened when all the camaraderie was relegated to the handshake and no more. I was there. I understood your desire for freedom. You will remember then, and when you do, you will know that I was real, that I did not pretend or intend to crush you when I leaned. You will remember when you do. Maybe I will still be there, somewhere among the songs and garlands, a memory.
Mm. Wow.
So that one's really speaking to me and
Mm.
just about the impact we leave and the what it means to be present in these struggles.
Mm. Yeah.
And the other one that I wanted to bring, which is very apropos for what I've been experiencing the last few days out here in California with all the huge storms that have come through. And this is one that I come back to quite often. This is actually a kind of a warm up tongue twister for those that have spent time in the theater. And it goes like this: whether the weather be good or whether the weather be not, whether the weather be cold or whether the weather be hot, well, whether the weather, whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. And then
Wow.
you say that over and over and over and over and over again to get that mouth moving. But well, whether the weather, whatever the weather, whether we like it or not, is kind of how I'm feeling out here in the storm. But also what I go back to when I think about the kind of larger context of the climate crisis that we find ourselves in right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. and the resiliency of us, the people,
Yep.
to address whatever we face together.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Wow. Thank you, Tom. Two beautiful and very different poems. I love that.
Yep.
Thanks for calling in those both of those energies.
Absolutely. Now I'm looking forward to hearing yours.
Yes. So my beat is a really brief story of my time working at a high school before I started working at Peers. I was running a wellness center and doing restorative justice work at a high school. And for those who don't know what restorative justice is, it's a powerful healing alternative to the current punitive system that impacts how we deal with conflict, violence, and crime in our communities. Um, so I would facilitate these circles with youth impacted by the juvenile hall system in whatever fashion or way. And we discuss really powerful things, whatever they wanted to talk about that could help them understand themselves and life. And these kids, primarily Black and brown boys, really opened up with each other. And one time I asked them to reflect on whether money provides happiness. And of course, lots of the kids responded the way they were taught, like, hell yeah, money and cars and girls all day, every day, get rich or die trying. Um, Yet I'll never forget a response by one of the boys who had a lot going on in his life, and we built a really powerful and strong relationship with each other, probably the first adult he ever trusted. And so he really took the time to share when the talking piece came to him. And when he spoke, he said, "Money provides happiness only if you share it."
Hmm.
So sharing and gift economies, what we're going to talk about today, serve as such a powerful, real antidote to the loneliness epidemic and the corporate driven agendas affecting all of our communities. And this is the type of society I'd like to see where we build community to not only feel better, but get better as a society. And as consultant and community leader Peter Block says, how do you change the world? One room at a time. Which room? The one you're in. And I think the principles and practices of sharing with each other is where we can start. So, what drew you to sharing and community organizing?
Yeah, I was fortunate to be born into it. I'm one of 10 kids, and kind of it's really like the layers of the onion, if you will. So starting at that on that interior side, I'm one of 10 kids. So I had all these brothers and sisters. Not all grew up in the home, but grew up in pretty close proximity. And then the next layer outside of that was that my family is part of about 13 families that own 26 acres as a community land trust.
Mm,
So I was raised to share water and share the land with others, and in a way that we would maintain our own water systems. We had a semi off the grid system, um, and and then the next layer outside of that was that land trust was within a community of about 200 people,
mm,
in an unincorporated area where not only were people sharing water and there was a series of water co-ops, but we also maintained the roads together and had our own community governance system and did participatory budgeting. And it's what I would refer to as a semi-autonomous, unintentional community. It was really kind of rooted in my own kind of development, kind of what it means to maintain shared infrastructure.
mm.
And so as a 10-year-old, I was out there, I would save my funky shoes every year because I knew that paving day was coming up. And at 10 years old, I was out there with an asphalt rake, like paving the road and pulling the asphalt out of the back of the dump truck, and out there with the community, with everybody would show up. Um, and so then, not only was I out there doing the labor, but I was enjoying the road itself. We were riding down on our bicycles. We were building go-karts and driving them down the road. In the summer nights, we would hang out laying in the middle of the road, in places where we had lots of view, whether or not a car was coming from above or from behind us. And the road was a gathering place. So it was a vital, it was a kind of a vital pathway for the community. It wasn't just for cars and it wasn't just for bikes. It was for congregating. People walked, people met, and and all of those experiences were rooted back to the process of maintaining that road, were made possible by maintaining that road. And so that I think really, fired my synapses and worked my neuroplasticity and really got that connective tissue working out for what it means to really be in community and what it takes to be able to maintain that. And then at the same time, the community that I was in is one that had been it had been, historically 150 years beforehand. The town began because it was a logging town, and it's in the San Francisco Bay Area, close to Oakland, California, and they came through and within 50 years had logged every single old growth redwood tree. They didn't leave a single one. I mean, to the point that up on one of the nearby ridges in between us and Oakland, there was these two trees that were called the captain's trees that ship captains would use out in the Pacific Ocean to find the opening to the San Francisco Bay. Because the fog was so heavy, they would have to be going up, and they were also able to make sure they didn't run into any rocks, rocks, and they navigated off of these two trees. And now there's a plaque on the ground where once they stood.
Wow.
And so there was this lack of foresight for for these vital communal collective resources by generations previous that we learned the lessons of. So we would have class, 20 students sitting inside of an old growth redwood stump.
Wow.
And so you make those connections between what it means to consciously and intentionally maintain collective resources, those that are of the current collective and the generations to come. And also, what happens when you don't do that? Being with having a bunch of elders in my community who were active, who were working on projects and hearing stories of the 60s and the 70s and of the food conspiracies and the protest movements that were led outside of from the community that I was living in, and the vocations for social change, which was the first it's kind of like before Idealist or anything else like this. This was back in the 70s. It was the first guidebook for finding kind of social environmental projects around the United States. Was developed, and it was developed in the Midwest, and then they moved their headquarters to my community, and it was published out of there. And a number of people that were my friends' parents, had come into the community because they'd worked on vocations for social change. So there was the Port Chicago Vigil that was part of a key part of the anti-nuke movement during the Vietnam War out of the Bay Area was run out of that same space. So there was just so much history in the community that I was in that I was able to draw from and be inspired by.
Your organization, Shareable, which is really quite incredible when you go on the site, shareable.net. You've got like hundreds of how-to public resource guides on mutual aid networks, I love this, ranging from like starting a co-op, living off grid, starting an emergency battery network in your community, creating a neighborhood work group, starting a community currency. So Shareable engages in a wide range of services and offerings to communities. So I'd love to hear more about what you all do and what wisdom does Shareable offer to the world.
Yeah, so Shareable started back in 2009. We're just working towards our 15-year anniversary. And initially, the thought behind it was really the inspiration behind it was the story of stuff. I don't know if you've ever seen the story of stuff video or not. Just for those that may not have seen it, Annie Leonard, who is now the director of Greenpeace USA, had been kind of studying the waste stream for a very long time and put together this amazing video where she starts with an iPod. So this is before iPhone, with an iPod, and she's holding that iPod and she's got this white screen behind her, and she's like, "Do you have one of these?" "I do. I love it. It's great. I can listen to my music whenever I want. I can take it here. I can take it there. But where do the materials come from to make it? And how did it get to me? And what's going to happen when it breaks?" And then Annie goes through the whole take, make, waste cycle, from looking at the iPod, but pulls back and looks at it as a whole with these amazing animations behind her. And that video ended up launching a book and a whole series of videos, and now it's a international campaign that has come from there. And there was a small family foundation in Florida which saw the video and they thought, we really need to get in front of this. Like, we need a story of sharing. And so they started pulling together people that had worked on the story of stuff, that had been advisors for that, and the story of stuff folks that had worked on that video, like pulled together Neil Gorenflo, who became our initial founding executive director and co-founder, and they kind of designed this organization, which initially was like, hey, we need to start a sharing movement. Like, that's what we need to do to get in front of this. And very quickly they realized that they didn't need to start a sharing movement. There was an amazing sharing movement already happening all over the world. It just wasn't being talked about. And so then realized that the niche that needed to be filled was that storytelling niche, was kind of lifting up these examples, these proven examples on the ground, and also the things that we're incubating, the stories, that the projects that people were just trying out. And so to date, we've published now over 4,500 stories about the ways that people are sharing resources around the world in the last, now 15 years. And along the way, we realized, all right, well, we want to do more than just tell the stories. Like, we want to help grow this movement. And so we started working with community organizers and networking them together and supporting them to start new projects. We did kind of large scale distributed actions where we would have 50 groups in cities around the world, all mapping their community assets at the same time and making these big public maps. And we did that for a few years in a row. We supported groups to put on sharing festivals. And we began to kind of document some of the best examples that we saw, the most replicable, both the city policies that we thought were really beneficial, that were kind of bringing the community in to participate, and also the ground up examples where communities were just taking action in their own hands to meet kind of basic city needs around housing and food, waste, water, finance, governance, technology, work, energy, mobility. We looked at these kind of 11 core city sectors, and we did this amazing global fellowship program. We had 15 fellows in 9 different countries that joined us to put together this guide. It's called Sharing Cities, Activating the Urban Commons. And we published that book, and anybody can download it for free off of our website and get the free PDF. And the book's gone around the world, and city policymakers have used it. It's been translated, parts of it have been translated into many different languages, but the entire book was translated into French and distributed around to various French leadership. And, mayors are using it. City council members brought us in as a result of that. And so we were able to go from telling the stories to supporting the organizers to start new projects and to grow their local movements, to then grabbing some of the best practices that were coming out of that and using them to both advocate and advise various city policymakers around the world to grow a global sharing cities movement, which, at its peak had over 100 different municipalized sharing cities programs that were being led by various city leaders around the world, and had brought it into their overall, their larger policy work. So that's kind of the history of Shareable, up until about 5 years ago. And some of this work has continued through then, but in the last 5 years, we've been starting to make a bit of a transition of our work. And one of those things that happened was that in 2017, in the United States, we had the most disastrous year on record. At that point, there was these 16 major disasters, which led to thousands of losses of life in the United States, and over $100 billion in damages. And we started to see the impacts of climate change were really happening. There was not something out in the future, like they were happening now. And a lot of the projects and the policies that we were advocating for were going to be impacted by climate change. And we wanted to kind of think a little bit more about, what that looked like and what sharing looks like in these times. And so that's when we developed our project called The Response, which documents how communities are building collective resilience in the wake of disasters. And these might be things like hurricanes and wildfires, but also reactionary politics, right? And so looking at kind of what we think of disasters a little bit more holistically. And so we've now been doing that work since 2018, which has included, I I think about 13 audio documentaries so far that we've been out on 150 radio stations around the United States and Canada and Australia. We've got an award-winning film about Puerto Rico and its response to Hurricane Maria and all the mutual aid centers that popped up there. And we have an ongoing podcast series, which you can find just called The Response as well, which has that mix of audio documentaries, but then also regular interviews and conversations like the one we're having today. And so that was a big part of our work now moving forward. And then we've also been kind of working on our education side of our work. And we have a lecture series we partner on with Tufts University called Cities at Tufts with the Urban Planning Department, which is really focused on kind of uplifting diverse perspectives in urban planning. And it was funny that, you gave your the connective bead, right, to start this. Just this morning, we had an event which you can find the recording on shareable.net, which was called How to Fight a Mega Jail, which was focused on the kind of the collaborative organizing of both the Chinese American community and also Black and Brown communities in New York City, which are fighting against a new mega jail, which is going to be replacing Rikers Island, essentially, and that are really looking at the impact of how that new potential jail would be impacting the Chinatown community and everything else like that. So there's an hour-long lecture about how to prevent that, but really it dives into how do we come up with alternative models towards incarceration, and how do we look at these things more holistically rather than just building prisons to house people but not actually address the problems that are leading to those. So Cities at Tufts is another resource. And then the final thing that I'll talk about, although there's more things I could talk about too, because our work is all over the place, is that our newest program we've been developing is called Solidarity Works. And it's really kind of, we're diving back into the community organizing work and looking at, we started by looking at some of our past how-to guides and thinking about how do we build community around the replication and adaptation of proven social infrastructure. So one that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about our how-tos was the how to set up an emergency battery network. And last year, it was the pilot for our new program was around that concept. We had 60 people sign up, and we currently have about 15 new emergency battery networks that are cropping up around the United States. Modeling, and the way that we work is that we find an organization that's really doing it on the ground, that's demonstrated that the model works and that has the knowledge. And in this case, it was the People Power Solar Cooperative in Oakland, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they had a program called the People Power Battery Collective, which had all these different emergency electric generators distributed around the Bay Area, so that when there was power shutoffs, they could be redistributed to people who needed them in a very quick and efficient way because they were already out in the community. And so we worked with them, and they were able to educate all these other groups over the course of 8 weeks, and then send them on their way to start developing these new networks. So that's kind of our work in a really big nutshell. I'm not sure what the biggest nut there is, but I think we probably filled that shell with those stories. And that's kind of like the root. But it really gets down to kind of our core values at Shareable are solidarity, abundance, curiosity, liberation, and celebration. And really feel like all of those pieces are really core to the work that we do.
Like I totally woke up when I learned about how Detroit and communities in Michigan, and I think some indigenous tribes in San Diego were building electric cooperatives to build their own internet network in the
Yep.
face of net neutrality rollbacks in 2016. And that totally woke me up that I think Michigan, the electric co-op, they had speeds in the top 20% in the whole country.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so for Project Censored, when I was doing work with Project Censored, where we talked about news that wasn't making the news, I was like, why isn't this being made public? This is incredible. And instead of making Trump wrong,
Yeah.
why don't we talk about the communities that are just creating alternative systems?
We have a how-to guide on Shareable about how to create your own neighborhood internet mesh network to do exactly what you're talking about.
Amazing. On your site, you all really get into the weeds about specific practices. Like I know you all have done a lot of stuff on the library of things, which I
Mm.
don't know if you want to briefly talk about for those who don't know what that is, but that's such an inspiring thing for communities.
Yeah, and that's actually it's a great time because it's something we've got coming up and a way for people to plug into our work. So libraries of things have been around for a while. An easy way to think about it is just it's like a regular library except for things, for kitchen equipment, for um, tools or toys. There's many different types of libraries of things out there. I actually happen to be a co-founder of the Asheville, North Carolina tool library. And there's now, I think, close to about 2,000 kind of formalized libraries of things around the world. I think over 100 of those are tool libraries just in the United States. And so they're
Mm.
really popping up all over the place. And so I'm very passionate about them and have not only started the one in Asheville, but also supported other groups to start them in places in the United States and internationally. And so as part of our program Solidarity Works, we're going to be running a 12-week collab on how to start a library of things in your community, which is going to be starting just at the orientation is on February 27th at Tuesday, February 27th. You can find out all those details on our website on shareable.net. And so it's a free course where we're going to have lectures every week for 12 weeks in a row, looking at all the different aspects of what it takes to be able to run one of those. And then afterwards, we'll be putting together kind of the best practices from those courses, but then also just from the larger kind of hive mind of practitioners that are doing this already, and putting together kind of a very, very comprehensive toolbox for starting a library of things, including, bylaws and how to work with members and agreements and all the paperwork. And do we need insurance? What insurance do we need to get? How do we get it? All of that stuff we're going to be covering for people who want to be able to start a formal or an informal library of things in their community or neighborhood. So for those that aren't familiar with time banks, they are kind of like what they sound like. It's a bank, but of time, where people will kind of sign up. Generally, these are kind of on digital platforms, and there's a few of them where they will kind of write in all the skills that they're willing to offer other people in their community for no charge. And it creates this amazing bank of skills. And then when somebody within that bank needs some support on something, let's say they're need a plumber to come, or they need a massage, or they need somebody to drive them to a medical appointment, or walk their dog, whatever it is, you can look on in the bank and find somebody that that has offered those skills, and then request them. And then when that person comes and does something for an hour or two, they get an hour or two of credit. And and so because it's a one for one system, so everybody's hours are worth the same, whether or not you're a doctor or a dog walker. And because it's just 1 hour from 1 hour, it's the only legally non-taxable exchange in the United States, because it's an hour for an hour. So now it's been a number of years, but there used to be a number of prominent barter networks that were set up. And the federal government actually cracked down on those barter networks because they weren't extracting any tax from those exchanges. And so the time bank is kind of a subversive way of exchanging with each other within your community legally without having to extract tax. And so it's pretty powerful. So they've been around for quite a while, and in many neighborhoods, like, this is happening anyways, right? Like, people are supporting each other one way or the other. You get to know people, but the the time bank kind of exists to help kind of bridge the gaps of people that maybe are left out of those things, right? Because a lot of those times it can be really insular, where people just share with the people they know or whatever, and the time bank helps to open that out. But really, the goal is to kind of transform culture, right? So it's what we often find with time banks is that people will join them, they'll maybe do a few exchanges, and they'll track them on the time bank, but then most likely they're supporting people outside of the time bank, and they're not actually tracking those hours, and the impact of that time bank is much larger than what is just tracked within that digital system itself. So that's a time bank, a good example of a way of sharing skills And and it ties into kind of what we think of along with libraries of things as what we refer to as like a real sharing economy, as opposed to thinking about like an Uber or an Airbnb, which are really kind of hyper capitalist and incredibly extractive when you peel back the quote unquote sharing veneer.
Well, I know that one of your favorite activities to do
Yeah.
is to host community stone soup events wherever you travel to help, as you say, remind people of how good sharing can taste.
Yeah. Just very quickly, for those who are not familiar with the story of stone soup, it's kind of the metaphor for my work as a whole, and it's a very old story. It was first put into print in the 1700s, but it's known to be older than that as an oral tradition. And in some places, it's known as stone soup. In other places, it's nail soup. Where my wife is from in Spain, she learned of the story as a child, known as axe soup. So it's got a number of different versions, and it's got some kind of overlap with kind of the archetype of the loaves and fishes story as well. But essentially, the way the story goes, or at least the way that I connect with it, anyways, is that there was this traveler who was trying to get home after a prolonged war, and due to this war, there was a deep scarcity, kind of a feeling of scarcity across the land, and as a result, everybody kind of retreated, into their own little spaces and lived in kind of a state of fear that others might take things away from them, and so they just grew the food that they could have, and they didn't really interact with their neighbors very much, and so it was this scarcity of spirit, and and so it led to a large famine, a food famine as well. Anyhow, so this is kind of the context that's been going on, in this prolonged wartime and how that can divide people. And so now, now the war is kind of starting to come to an end, and our traveler is ready to try to get home. And as they start to walk back to their own village, everywhere they go, they knock on a door, they ask for a place to stay or a little bit of food, they're turned away, nothing for you here. Move on to the next town, move on to the next village. You're not welcome. And after this happening a few times, our traveler realized that what the war didn't do to them, the road would, and they wouldn't survive. They wouldn't actually make it home to see their village and see their family. And so, after thinking about it for a little while, they came up with a clever plan. And so the next village they got to, they knocked on the door, same thing, no food for you, no place for you to stay, move on to the next town. And our traveler said, don't worry about me. I'm going to go into the town square and I'm going to make some stone soup. Well, the person at the door, all they heard was there was some stranger in town that was going to be making some soup. And pretty soon, that's the rumor that spread from house to house throughout the village. And our traveler went to the town square, and fortunately, there was still a communal well, and they drew water out of that well, and they filled their pot, and they lit a fire underneath. And as the water began to heat up, one by one, everybody from the village showed up to see this spectacle, to see what was happening. And once everybody had gathered, our traveler reached into their satchel and pulled out a stone and made sure that everybody could see that stone. And once everybody saw the stone, they dropped it in the pot. And after a few moments to build some anticipation, they dipped their spoon in and breathed in some of that stone soup aroma, slurped a little sip of that stone soup, and said, "Ah, this is some good stone soup. But what would be better is some stone soup with cabbage." Well, sure enough, somebody there had some cabbage at home, and they're like, got a little bit of cabbage back in my place, and that soup sounds pretty good. I bet if I went back and got some cabbage and brought it, this traveler would let me have some of that soup. And sure enough, they got their cabbage, brought it back, chop, 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 into the pot it went. Now again, just another moment to build a little bit of suspense, and our traveler dips in and now breathes in that stone soup with cabbage aroma, takes a little sip and says, "Ah, now this is some good stone soup. But this one time I had some stone soup with a little bit of spiced beets. That was stone soup that was fit for a queen." My goodness, I've never had anything that was fit for a queen, somebody thought to themselves in the group. And they went back and they had a little bit of spiced beets and they brought it back. And again, into the pot it went. And one by one, everybody in the village went and got something, some carrots or some onions or some greens, some herbs, maybe some salt. No matter what they had, they brought something to it. In the end, that soup was actually quite delicious. And it nourished them in a way they hadn't been fed in a long time. Not just the food itself, but the community spirit that they got back from it. And that night, they had an incredible party, the first party they'd had in years. And they all celebrated the soup and the traveler, but they celebrated each other. They celebrated the community. And that night, they made sure the traveler had a nice place to stay, and they all gathered the next morning to wish the traveler well as they were about to go on their way. And they asked the traveler, they pleaded, they begged, please, please leave us with that magic stone. Now, there's a few different ways that the story ends. One of them is that the traveler says, all right, I'll sell you this magic stone. And I want some food, and I want some money, I want some this, I want some that. And then they hightailed it out of town to make sure that, nobody that they were ahead of the speed of rumor, to make sure that the rumor didn't catch up and they could do their grift again. I don't like that version. And I don't think that's what really happened. The version that I connect with, that I think is probably what actually happened, is the traveler said, all right, I'll leave you this magic soup stone. But remember that it's magic and it only works if you come together to make the soup. If just one of you tries to make the soup all by yourself, not only will it not work, but the magic will be lost forever. And then the traveler continued on their way, and they hosted another stone soup and another stone soup. And everywhere they went, they reseeded community. They brought people back together, and they made sure that people were fed, not just with food, but in spirit, as I said. And so that story, that story of sharing, really gets down to the work that we do as an organization, where we work from community to community and try and kind of invigorate people's communal leanings, attributes. But it also speaks to the need for the power of storytelling and the need for just a little bit of trickery every once in a while to remind people of their best interests. And when you use your magic, really for good, to support people like that, just a little bit of that magic can go a long way. I had been doing a bunch of work for a couple of years around advocating for GMO labeling in the United States for genetically modified food, and had been involved in a kind of co-led a march from New York City to Washington, D.C. in 2011. We had 313 miles over 16 days and events the whole way. And I'd been working in the next year in 2012 in California on Prop 37 to support GMO labeling on the state level, and had co-coordinated the biggest march for GMO labeling in California, which is in San Francisco. And we did banner drops and actions all over the state. And unfortunately, we narrowly lost that, being massively outspent by Monsanto and other biotech companies. But it planted a seed for a lot of people. And that following year, I had an opportunity to organize a large scale event in Washington, D.C. at the Food and Drug Administration, calling on GMO labeling and kind of food democracy. But the event didn't start out that way. I was actually asked to coordinate the Michael Taylor takeover. And so I said, yeah, I'll do it. And the goal was to bring, people, to organize buses and vans and bring people from all over the East Coast for this large scale event. And after a couple of days or a couple of weeks actually of trying to organize these buses and vans, a lot of the organizers and people that I knew from, years of doing activist work were like, we really want to get a bus together, but nobody we talk to knows who Michael Taylor is. And listeners, viewers, those of you who don't, if you don't know who Michael Taylor is, don't feel bad about it. Most people don't, but he plays a very, very major role, or has historically played a major role in the food that's available across the United States. So Michael Taylor was a lawyer for Monsanto for years, and then he worked with the first Bush administration to create the substantially equivalent language that allowed genetically modified foods to be grown and sold in the United States without any labeling or without any advanced testing. He then, continued his work with Monsanto and then was brought back and got bovine growth hormone approved by the USDA, which was a Monsanto product. He then was the chief lobbyist, head lawyer and chief lobbyist for Monsanto. And then Obama, in his first term, made Michael Taylor, created a new position within the administration and made Michael Taylor the National Food Safety Czar. Talk about the fox being let into the hen house. And so there was this opportunity when Obama got reelected and he was starting his second term. There was a number of different cabinet members that were transitioning out at that point in time. It was a natural point to put some pressure. So the idea was to try to put pressure on the Obama administration to fire Michael Taylor, so he would no longer be in that very, very powerful position. But the language, the event was being hosted by Occupy Monsanto. The language around it was the Michael Taylor takeover. It was incredibly aggressive, and it was related to somebody that had been hiding in the shadows that nobody knew who that really was. And it wasn't going to be an effective campaign. And so I had to sit down with a number of the other organizers, and I was like, hey, what if we shift the story? What if we shift the focus? And what if instead of this Michael Taylor takeover, we do an eat-in at the FDA? And everyone was like, oh, it's like part be-in, part sit-in, tied with the food. Like, all right, so there's like this historical context to it. And I was like, and let's take it one step further. Let's do a stone soup. And they're like, oh, what's that? Told them the story of stone soup. And so that's what we landed on. And we did this eat-in at the FDA and had people bus in from 14 different states around the East Coast. Hundreds of people showed up. And we got there that day, and there was 27 like fully clad riot officers, with machine guns and sun guns and tear gas and everything, full masks, like whole thing waiting for us out in front of the FDA. And, we'd let them know we were coming. We'd sent them invitations. Like, we were very clear that what was going to be happening. And so we drove around the corner and we unloaded all of our stuff and we put it on our carts and we brought it up to them. And the two of their kind of lead officers pulled myself and one of the other organizers aside, separately, and said, hey, we want to talk to you about what's going down. I was like, great, happy to have a conversation. I noticed very, very quickly with the officer that I was talking to that he had his arms inside of his bulletproof vest. What I knew was that it was actually a de-escalation technique, that he was keeping his hands up on his chest so they weren't down by his gun or his stun gun or anything else like that, and they weren't out aggressively towards me. And so I let him know that I knew that he was doing just that. And I said, oh, you've got your hands behind your vest because it's a de-escalation technique. And he was stunned. He was like, wait, what? And I was like, how did you? And I was like, well, I have led some workshops before for activists on how to deal with police and how to de-escalate situations. And he was like, I teach workshops to civilians about how to work and how to interact with police. And we all of a sudden had this connection right away, right? And like the like fear or like power dynamic kind of started to shift. And I was like, do you know why we're here today? And he was like, oh yeah, I know what's going on. I know what's going on with the bees and colony collapse. And I know what's going on with our food. And I said, good. And he's like, because I think we're making a pretty good point about we should be shifting some policy. He was like, yeah, you've got a point. And I said, look, we're going to have the most amazing event. It's going to be beautiful. There's going to be women. There's going to be children. There's going to be grandparents. This is going to be a protest like you've never, ever seen. And he was like, all right. And sure enough, that's what showed up, because one of the things that we did was before the event happened, we went through everything, every single step of it. And we thought, all right, if one person came and was here for 15 minutes, what would they walk away with? Like, what would be the image in their mind of what we were doing, how we were doing it, and why we were doing it? And so we organized the entire event around that story. We wrote that story. We thought, okay, if this story goes, viral and goes all over in newspapers all around the United States, like what do we want that story to be? And we wrote it out. We wrote out what our ideal news story was going to be, and then designed the event all along that. And sure enough, people came. It was this most amazing action. We had a big sound system that was facing up towards the FDA offices, and all of the hundreds of people who showed up, everybody got a chance to get on the microphone and say who they were, where they'd come from, why they came, what their message was to the FDA, and what ingredient they'd brought for the soup. And so we had this giant soup pot that was just amazing. And the soup was actually quite delicious. Like you would think that, hundreds of people all bringing ingredients, trying to make a soup all at once in an afternoon in front of the FDA on the side of the road. It was great. And so, people from the FDA were like at their windows the entire time, like listening and seeing the spectacle. The riot cops left before we did. We like took over the whole grass in front. We had teach-ins going on. We did seed swaps, and we really lived into the intention of what we were pushing for. We're like, here is a microcosm of what we want, right? So it wasn't just the Michael Taylor takeover, stop doing this terrible stuff. We're gonna blockade, we're gonna do whatever. It was like, no, you got to stop doing what you're doing. What you're doing is harmful, but here's a better way. And we're going to carry ourselves with that, and we're going to showcase that. And so there was a number of different press there, like television channels and reporters and everything. And sure enough, 2 days later, lead op-ed in the Washington Post written by Dana Milbanks, he had actually come to write a hit piece about what we were doing because it was under the Occupy Monsanto. And instead, he wrote the story that we wanted to have out there. And it ended up getting syndicated by over 100 newspapers around the United States. And so it went from, again, like starting with this folktale, figuring out how do we bring this into our bodies and bring this into our communities, and then how do we share that out with the larger world to not just impact those that we may be targeting, like the FDA, with our action, but to reverberate out to people all over the United States that have no, or around the world that aren't connected to the issue at all, but still resonate with that connection.
I actually just feel like I ate a full meal listening to all of that. So
Yeah.
great, so touching, so wholesome. It reminds me this quote that says something along the lines that we've been so focused on topple the mighty approaches to creating change that we forgot what it means to raise up the people. It just reminds me of like Julia Butterfly Hill, who said, I
Mm-hmm.
didn't climb the redwood trees because I was angry at the corporations. I climbed the redwood trees because when I climb it and I connect with the trees, it's the feelings of connection that drive me. It's my love for the natural world. And I love that you deeply influenced, this really big event and that it was so much larger than just that day. It was like, how do we engage in these issues and how do we connect with anyone, no matter where they stand, for something that goes way deeper than just like politics and policies. And so I love that. That's so touching. I'm actually curious too. It's like there's so many examples of how sharing can just transform the way we do life. And especially now with things looking so tenuous and lots of different challenges coming our way. What are some of the challenges of sharing? That or maybe some barriers or roadblocks
Mm-hmm.
to effective sharing.
Yeah, I think there's always a certain amount of fear. Like are, we've been living in this capitalist system for so long, right? That we feel as if, there has to be some sort of a financial transaction that if there's not, then, one person is taking advantage of the other, right? Or, someone's gonna borrow an item and then not give it back, or they're going to damage it and what happens. And so there's a, rightfully a fair bit of anxieties that are there. I'm not saying that the anxieties are right, but because of the cultural context that we find ourselves in, it's completely understandable to have those anxieties around that. The place that I've seen it happen, that one pathway for that opening is kind of like the silver lining on the cloud of disasters. And I talked about a little bit earlier about how we have been documenting disasters around the world for the last 5 years. And it's those moments of disruption that kind of cause people to release a lot of their preconceived notions of others around them, right? And there's a great example during Hurricane Sandy. A woman who was pretty ragtag and brought a number of people together had a water pump and was going around just knocking on people's doors saying, "Hey, would you like us to pump out your basements?" And give that help. And one of the first person that she knocked on, it turns out it was a retired police officer. And the retired police officer was a little standoffish at first, but ended up being, really appreciative, and they pumped out the house. And then a couple of days later, they would come by and there were sandwiches that were put out on the front porch, because it was the gratitude of this person who'd had their their basement pumped. And one of the most powerful quotes that came from that story was, of this woman who the organizer was recounting to us, that the retired police officer told her, she was like, "Hey, a week ago, I wouldn't have given you directions to the train. And now I've given you the keys to my home." And so like that's just such an incredible barrier that was broken, by this larger disruption of the disaster of the hurricane. But it was through just a positive example, right? Like that othering was wiped away. And I think that's the one unfortunate way of breaking these barriers, right, is having these disasters. And the unfortunate thing and is that we're going to continue to have more of them, right? So there's going to be more and more opportunities to be able to break down those barriers, and we're going to need to. I mean, one of the things that we've documented is that most people, most of the time, when a disaster or disruption happens, it brings out their best selves. And you wouldn't necessarily know that because so much of the news coverage is around, basically projecting people to be in one of a few categories. One, victims. The people that are there when the disaster happened are all victims. That they highlight a few heroes, oftentimes that are coming from outside of the community, as opposed to looking at the kind of the collective heroicism of the community, and then projecting people, most of the time black and brown folks, as being criminals, as the disaster bringing out the animal nature.
Mm,
And it's those projections, those kind of media narratives, that causes people to be fearful
yeah.
when these disasters happen. And so that's one of the things that we really try to do with the response, is to break that away and to showcase example after example about the ways that disasters actually brought together most people to do amazing work that they wouldn't have done otherwise.
Oh, I love how you spelled out kind of just media response and what we tend to focus on in the face of disaster or crises. Because a lot of the times, too, it's like trust the powers that be, trust the government, and not trust each other. And that's been a
Yep.
narrative foisted upon us on many different fronts. Meg Wheatley, who's this amazing organizational development consultant, leader in community building, and she talked about how she interviewed a person that survived the 9/11 attacks, and that the insight that this person got was that none of us were focused on saving ourselves. The only thing we were focused on was saving each other. And it wasn't some sort of like, oh, this is probably the right thing to do. It's like it was this natural
Yeah.
instinct, this felt sense of, I need to do this. All the topics in the news that are weaponizing our emotions, pumping us up with fear and
Mm-hmm.
division, and the real challenges we face, it's really important that we call in the best of human good.
Yep.
So that actually leads to my next question. What gives you hope or faith in our collective future? I love this because sometimes, for many of our readers too, who look at a lot of dark stuff with government and corporate
Mhm.
corruption, it can be really hard to feel any sense of hope or faith in our future. So what gives you that energy?
What I started with that, well, whether the weather, whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. And I think the communities are really starting to um, strengthen their collective muscles. And we saw this a lot with the pandemic, right? So when lockdowns first started, all of a sudden there was this amazing rise of mutual aid networks all over the United States and around the world, right? Where people were taking care of their neighbors, making sure people got food, making sure that people weren't wasting away inside their apartments and figuring out ways to come together even if they were, not in close proximity to each other. And so people rose to that challenge, I think, in many, many, many cases. And so that gives me hope, because we're going to have more and more opportunities like that where that's needed.
Thank you so much, Tom, for, doing this interview on a generator on your land in the face of the California storms. I really appreciate you offering your wisdom to our readers and whoever tunes into this video, to just really be fed by what human goodness can look like, even in the face of all that we're scared of, all that is unclear about how we're going to go into our future, the way it's looking. So I think that Shareable and what you offer is a great resource for the collective. And so maybe just a quick few words about where we can support your work. You've mentioned here and there peppering in some upcoming free courses, some
Yeah.
events.
You can find everything we do at shareable.net. And so if you just go there, that gives you portals to our Cities at Tufts lecture series, to our Solidarity Works programs like the Library of Things collab or the Emergency Battery collab, and all the rest that we'll be producing, to our over 300 how-to guides on how to share with your neighbors and communities. As you mentioned, it's a huge range of things from, how to become a lawyer without going to law school, down to how to share a chicken with your next door neighbor, right? So it's a large gamut, and then also to find the response, our ongoing conversation series. You can also find our film about Puerto Rico there, and you can find us, online. We're on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and just look up at Shareable on those platforms, and find the response wherever you get your podcasts.
You are an incredible role model for what resilience could look like, and especially during these times. So thank you so much for joining peers and for sharing your work with our readers.
Yeah, thank you so much.